The Bicycle Frame Builder's Apprentice, Chapter 14. Malc, here's a cup of tea for you. What? Oh, it's you, Connie. Where's Tom? The youngster grinned at the head popping out of the tent, obviously only half awake. He's tucking into a proper breakfast. He finally had the entrance to the fly sheet of the mountain tent fastened back, and the cup of tea Connie offered him, firmly in his hand. He took a sip and looked up at her. What time is it? Almost 9. She laughed before saying, Tom told me you needed a lion. He gazed at her through the vapour from his cup. I bet he told you never feed him either. He looked serious, but his hazel eyes were smiling. Does he do that a lot? Only when we're camping. He's usually catched at least one breakfast before I'm awake. That's why he leaves me to have a lion. There are people throughout the British Isles, and 1 or 2 in France, who think I neglect him. Well, get that down you, and come inside. I'll make your breakfast. Before he could protest, she was off, leaving him to sort himself out. Pearl and Mikey will be expecting them soon, and Connie was looking forward to her day out. Mikey Grimsditch and his mother had finished breakfast long ago. Unlike Mikey, Pearl was far from calm. She'd already taken the bike out for a run down to the village and back. Concerned she might not be able to keep up with the youngsters. She checked the tyres were hard, checked the brake and gear cables were in good condition, and then double-checked everything again. It had been a long time since she'd been on a bike ride of any distance, although she regularly used her old bone shaker to visit the local shops and friends. When they'd first informed her of their plans to visit Attersage, it hadn't fazed her, but now she was about to embark on the expedition. The thought of all the hills on the way made her question her original decision to accompany them. Do you want a cup of tea, ma'am? She turned towards her son. Yes, that'll be nice. But what time are they coming? Ma'am, how many more times? 10 o'clock. It's only 9:30. Well, we don't want to hold them up. We won't, unless you wear that bike out just looking at it. Connie, Rosie, Malc and Tom were knocking on the Grimsditch's door at 9:57 precisely. Mikey ushered them into the small front room of the terrace cottage. Mr. Hodgson's bike occupied centre stage, its handlebars and saddle leaning against the wall under the window, looking out on the Kinder Road. Not long after, having refused the offer of a cup of tea, the 6 members of the newly inaugurated Kinder Peregrine Road Club, led by Connie and Mikey, were riding down the lane into Hayfield. Their route, planned by Malc and Connie in advance, would take them to the outskirts of Chinley, where they would traverse a series of lanes to cut across to Rushup Edge, and from there head up to Mam Tor and descend into Edale. Malc and Tom brought up the rear on the tandem, the frame builder keeping an eye on his less experienced companions, like a sheepdog watching the flock. The A624 Glossop to Chinley Road can be busy at the best of times, and at weekends even more so. Luckily, for the first part of its journey, a lane known as Highgate Road runs out of the village, following the contours of the valley side, parallel with and above the main road, before joining the latter just before Chinley Head. It was this route Connie led them onto. The sky was clear, the southwesterly wind little more than a slight breeze, as they climbed up the narrow lane, bounded on both sides by dry stone walls, in the lee of Highgate Head. Finally they reached the junction with the main road. Luckily, it was clear of traffic, and within a short distance they'd passed Peep a Day, and entered the cutting, taking them over the summit at Chinley Head. Pearl breathed a sigh of relief. The first climb of the morning, and it hadn't troubled her too much. Rosie Ackroyd was having similar thoughts. The pace increased as they began the descent into Chinley, Connie leaning low over her handlebars to reduce air resistance, and young Mikey hanging in close to her back wheel, as she'd advised him to do, assuming he didn't wish to be left behind. He treated her advice with disdain at the time she'd voiced it, but he wasn't daft enough not to take it. They were now descending rapidly as the road dropped towards the valley bottom, so much so that Malc wondered if Connie had forgotten the need to take the lane off to the left before the main road plunged under the Manchester to Sheffield Railway. He needn't have worried. Connie signalled left in good time, turning back briefly to shout over her shoulder to Mikey to follow suit. They all followed in her wake as she turned into the small hamlet of New Smithy, climbing gently once more alongside a tree-lined stream. After an initial sharp bend to the left, the narrow lane curved around the hillside, and then Connie took another right-hand junction, ignoring the signpost for Slack House and Beat Farm. Once more they were climbing, this time between Gorsty Low and Breck Head, before descending to the T-junction at Breck End, having finally crossed the railway. Here Connie halted and waited for all to catch up, much to Malc's approval. He'd recognised that Connie's temperament might lead her to assume that everybody was as fast as herself, and, as a consequence, she might have a tendency to unwittingly leave others behind. As a result, he'd advised her that it was important not to allow the group to be split, and to always ensure nobody was left behind at every major junction. The youngster had obviously remembered his advice. Satisfied all her companions were present, she turned left and carried on up the lane, now so narrow it was scarcely wide enough for a car. Shortly after the lane split, and she took the right-hand curve, descending until they crossed a bridge, taking them over a fast-running brook into the tiny hamlet of Wash. The steep-banked hedgerow-lined lane now climbed steeply, and the gap between the riders steadily increased as their young leader forced her machine onwards and upwards over Bowden Head. Finally, she came to a halt outside the open gates of the Ford Hall estate at Slackhall, next to the junction with the main road, which would take them up Rushup Edge. The Ford Hall estate houses an impressive otter and owl centre. It also has a cafe, which acts as a magnet, attracting cyclists and walkers from many miles further afield. Malc and Tom eventually rode alongside Connie and Mikey. The frame builder advised the youngsters it was a good place to have a break and to let the others rest their legs and get their breath back, pointing out they had a long climb up the edge before them. Nobody disagreed. Rosie and Pearl were more than relieved, although their earlier fears they might be left behind or hold the group up were receding fast as their confidence increased. Once suitably refreshed, the six commenced the climb up Rushup Edge, but this time Malc took the lead. Tandems are slow uphill, which made the pace easy for Rosie and Pearl. At first the road climbed steeply, following the contours of a tree-lined hill to their right, the valley to their left shelving steeply below them, the higher they climbed. After the first mile or so, the terrain began to change dramatically as they achieved higher ground. The trees disappeared, and they found themselves with the distinctive ridge of Rushup Edge to their left, and the valley sloping gently down to their right. Views of open sky and an expanding vista of rolling hills and wild country unfolded before them. They were now travelling along the divide between the gritstone of the Dark Peak, marked by Rushup Edge itself, and the limestone of the White Peak. The incline gradually eased, and within another mile the road levelled out. Connie had made her move long before, and was streaking off alone, heading for the junction where the lane headed off to the left over Mam Nick to provide access to the Vale of Edale. Mikey let her go, content to remain on the tandem's rear wheel, as Malc speeded up in pursuit of Connie, egged on by Tom. Rosie and Pearl did their best to keep up, and at least had the assistance of a following wind. By the time they were within 100 metres of the junction, Connie had disappeared. Malc was only too well aware that to those not familiar with the road, the lane off to the left could come as a shock. It climbed steeply to cross the narrow divide between the ridge of Rushup Edge and the soaring bulk of Mam Tor, before descending just as steeply down the other side. He expected Connie to be waiting at the top of the initial climb. As it happened, he was right. Just before the turn off the main road, he asked Tom if the rest were in sight, and after a quick look over his shoulder, the lad confirmed they were. Malc nodded, turned left, and immediately climbed out of the saddle, dancing in the pedals, using the combined strength of arms and legs to force the tandem up towards the top of Mam Nick. Tom stayed in the saddle, whilst redoubling his own pedalling efforts. Connie was waiting at the summit, as Malc had expected. he forced his way over the final metre, grunting instructions to Connie to wait for the others as he passed by. With Tom's concentrated assistance he kept on going, and then they were accelerating at great speed, breaking on the curves as the narrow roads snaked down to the valley bottom below. Tom was in his element, urging his dad to go faster, as they reaped the benefits of their previous fight against gravity. The road was clear of traffic, and Malc ironed out the bends, crossing the white centre markings as the road curved to the right, and cutting the corners as it twisted left. Meanwhile, Connie did as he'd asked, letting the others begin their descent before setting off in their wake. Nonetheless, by the time Rosie, Pearl and Mikey were halfway down the hill, she'd gleefully swooped her way to the front again and was powering after the tandem. Unluckily for her, Malc had taken advantage of the straight immediately before the road levelled out and had reached a breathtaking 50 miles an hour. The momentum of the speeding tandem carried father and son over the gentle rises of the now undulating valley bottom, and by the time Connie got close, the tandem had come to a halt just before the junction with the lane leading off to Grimesbrook Booth, the given name of what is known by tourists as Edale Village. Tom sat in his place, looking back towards her, with a big grin splitting his mischievous little face. As Connie approached, he shouted, "See you at Cooper's Cafe," and before she could respond, the tandem was on the move once more, heading up the tree-lined lane, under the railway, past the Rambler on the left, and the National Park Information Centre to the right, before turning left into Cooper's Farm, immediately before the Nag's Head pub. The road out of Edale heading towards Hope is fairly flat, the one steep rise near the entrance to Clough Farm being quite short. The road itself runs parallel with the railway line, crossing from side to side as the terrain dictates. Shortly after Clough Farm, there's a short straight stretch with the railway on the right. 3 cars were parked by the railway embankment, and a number of people with cameras lay in wait. Malc noticed them, but it was Tom who urged him to stop. "I bet it's a steam special," he informed his dad, remembering a similar situation the previous year. Sure enough, the lad proved to be correct, and all were rewarded with the sight of the streamlined Sir Nigel Gresley in its distinctive blue livery, pulling 8 coaches full of railway enthusiasts on its excursion from Sheffield. The locomotive driver sounded the engine's steam whistle, as if in greeting to the enthusiasts who had bothered to wait at this remote spot to gain a photograph or two, and so it passed them in a cloud of swirling white vapour, a chuff of steam power, the acrid smell of anthracite smoke, and a clickety-clickety-clack of carriage wheels speeding over rail joints. They recommenced their ride. The River Noe, which up to then had flowed to the right of the railway, was now on their left. The valley opened up as it swung to the right to make its way towards the Oak Valley. They were soon swinging under a railway bridge, emerging to find the river on their right again. They made good speed around the eastern flank of Leweshill, the steep-sided slopes of Winhill rising impressively from the flat valley floor on their left. The fields of the valley were now lined with hedgerows as well as dry stone walls, their lush grass noticeably a brighter green than the herbage of those they'd left behind. Not so long after they crossed the river once more, and after riding past the Cheshire Cheese pub on their right, were pulling up at the crossroads opposite St. Peter's Church in Oak Village. The colour of the stone used for building materials had changed to a light whitish grey. They were in limestone country, and the River Noe had disappeared into the waters of the River Derwent. A quick check that all were together, and Connie took the lead again, taking the left onto the main road, closely followed by the tandem. Mikey dropped back to talk to Rosie and to encourage his mother. He needn't have worried about Pearl. Having never forsaken her old sit-up and beg, she'd not really lost her cycling legs. Moreover, she found the ride exhilarating, not least because the Etche was a light, sleek, state-of-the-art machine, especially when compared to the old heavy tank she was used to. Perhaps more importantly, her youthful memories of the bike ride she'd participated in before getting caught by being put in a family way at 16, and the great pleasure she'd derived from them, had come back to her mind as fresh as though they'd only taken place the day before. Like born-again Christians, born-again cyclists tend to be zealots, and Pearl was fast becoming one. Rosie, on the other hand, was beginning to feel tired, and her legs were starting to ache, although she didn't confide this information to anyone. She'd been hanging on to Pearl's back wheel for some time, and the foremost thought in her mind was how long would it take before they reached Athersedge and lunch. The signpost at the crossroads indicated it was 4 miles. Rosie hadn't noticed. She might have been cheered if she'd been aware they'd now cycled over 16 miles since leaving Pearl's. On the other hand, the knowledge she had another 4 to go, and then at least another 20 before the day was done, might have proved disheartening. No such thoughts were troubling young Connie. She was happy as the skylark, trilling so enthusiastically high above the adjacent river meadow. It was only 3 short months since the frame builder had given her the bike, but in those 3 months her world had been transformed. Malc had confided to her that a bike had been his passport to freedom and pleasure since he'd been 10 years of age, and that he couldn't imagine life without it. It provided transport for him in the town, and also his principal means of escape from that self-same town and urban drudgery. Connie was beginning to realise what he'd meant. She didn't have a dirty town to escape from, but she did have a whole new world to explore, and she intended to visit every little nook and cranny. She upped the pace slightly, full of confidence in her own prowess, and knowing it was a straight road into Athersedge, so none of the others were likely to get lost. About a couple of miles up the road, just past the junction to the left, heading for Bamford, Ladybower and the Snake Pass, a group of cyclists, who Malc informed her later were no doubt a chain gang of racing cyclists from Sheffield on a fast training ride, flashed past in a whir of freewheels and shining spokes on stripped-down, gleaming enamelled machines, a uniformed array of brightly coloured tops and black lycra shorts, riding 2 abreast. The temptation proved too much for the youngster. Her competitive spirit aroused, she set off in hot pursuit, and much to the frame builder's astonishment had jumped on the back wheel of the last of the group within 30 metres. The frame builder instinctively followed, having momentarily taken his right hand off the handlebars to snake it behind his back to give Tom's right hand a squeeze. His son recognised the signal and commenced pedalling hard. He enjoyed a chase as much as anybody. The tandem accelerated, and within a quarter of a mile they were on Connie's tail. Contented, Malc awaited the right time to make his next move. Maybe he could still teach Connie a thing or two. He looked down at his computer. 26 miles an hour. Not bad on the flat for a fit adult, but brilliant for a 13-year-old one-legged cripple. Tom took a look behind. The rest were in sight in the far distance, but only just. Pearl had taken the lead, and rather sensibly, she showed no sign of attempting to join the chase. Malc glanced to his left. They were passing the sign denoting they were entering the parish of Athersedge. He prepared himself to move out to the right to launch his attack, but as he did so, so did Connie. Almost before he could take it in, she was out of the saddle, powering forward alongside the group, who towed her along in their slipstream for so long without being aware of her presence. The rider to whose wheel she'd first attached herself attempted to follow, only to find a tandem alongside him preventing his egress. Tom smiled into his startled eyes, as if to say, "This is how you do it, just watch and learn." By now Connie was overtaking the lead pair of riders. She redoubled her efforts, finding she still had power in her legs. Thus she sprinted into the village high street, arms held high like a professional, her face a portrait of triumph, with Malc and Tom trailing a poor second in her way. She looked around, anticipating she'd be able to silently crow to the racing lads she assumed were still following, only to witness them taking the lane for Carver and Sheffield she'd just passed. Malc grinned at her and led the way to the Athersedge outside shop, above which was rather a good snack bar, frequented by walkers and cyclists alike.